How many artillery shells does Russia have? We're going to find out in this video today. Before we get into it, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Guys, if you're brand new here and you don't already know it, I'm a former Royal Marines commando from the United Kingdom, so I normally react to military-based content. We've been covering Ukraine and other topics over the past couple of months. So today, the question is, how many shells does Russia have left in terms of their artillery capability? We know they've got, quite a face and reputation around the world. That reputation has dwindled over the past few months for obvious reasons. But today, let's do it.
Russia relies heavily on artillery, and without it, there's a good chance their advances will come to a halt. Their air
Well, there's not a good chance it will come to a halt. You've got to think about how they progress historically. They bombard an area with heavy artillery, absolutely destroy everything in sight. They don't bother if they're hitting civilian buildings, anything goes, okay? And then their troops move forward. And when you absolutely smashed an area, it doesn't really matter how capable your troops on the ground are. If you've destroyed an area, there's nothing really to clear up in the first place. That seems to be their tactic going forward. It's a tactic they've used in the past.
Force hasn't been very active, the number of cruise missile strikes has been decreasing, and their tanks are extremely vulnerable to the large number of anti-tank weapons Ukraine has been receiving. Artillery is really Russia's lifeline, being used to soften up Ukrainian defenses before advancing. But how long can Russia keep up this high rate of artillery fire, especially considering the numerous ammo storage depots Ukraine has been destroying? Well, the numbers are not easy to find. Everyone online just seems to state that Russia has massive stockpiles of artillery rounds, but nothing to back that up or even any mention of any specific figure.
And is that just Russian propaganda filling all of these news outlets on social media and stuff? I think it actually might be, We've learned over the past few months, 5 months in particular, that Russia's capability isn't actually quite as large and quite as capable as they're mentioned and have been mentioned for generations. I think we should have learned from the Cold War. We should have learned from Afghanistan with Russia, but we haven't. This face and reputation seems to have followed them around. And I think it's down to one thing, the size of the Russian the country itself and obviously the military. But in terms of their capability, I personally don't think it's nowhere near the superpower that they once stated they were.
To make estimation easier for myself, we'll stick to just conventional hard-shell tube artillery, not counting rocket artillery, which Russia has a lot of, or the small man-portable mortars. In the US military, infantry is often called the queen of battle. Tanks, aircraft, ships are great, but they can't hold territory. You need boots on the ground, infantry. Russia has a different approach.
Right, do you agree with that then? Who agrees with that here? I know that's a question that gets asked an awful lot when we talk about war itself. Now, do we actually need boots on the ground? That is the big question of the day. If you think about it in terms of military strategy, the West has kind of adopted this we use a lot of smart bombs now. They're smart in the sense of you can drop them in a very specific area at a very defined time and place. Really, really accurate, some of these things. And what that does is it reduces the effects of having to put boots on the ground the old-fashioned way. Are we moving away from this old-school boots on the ground war theory? I think we actually are. We're not seeing an awful lot of it, especially since Afghanistan. I think moving forward, we'll see a lot more of this tactic and less boots on the ground. Seems like Russia hasn't really adopted that strategy fully yet. They seem to be behind the West militarily. They're always about 20, 30 years behind, I think, in terms of their strategy. What do you think? Let me know.
They've always put a lot greater emphasis on artillery, calling it the king of battle, or as
exactly what we just said as well. Emphasis on artillery. It works, but you need follow-up troops and stuff. I don't know.
Stalin put it, the god of war. And he wasn't wrong. During World War II, it's estimated artillery accounted for roughly 2/3 of all casualties. Ever since the Soviet Union, and by extension, now Russia, has put a lot of emphasis on artillery. That and mechanized forces. In Russia, everything is mechanized. They don't even have light infantry. They want everything flexible and able to maneuver, including artillery. First, some basic background and tactics of artillery that a lot of people miss. You can skip forward to this time here if you're not interested. The use of artillery has changed somewhat over time. In the past, artillery was more often used to soften up enemy defensive lines before an offensive. It wasn't very accurate, so they typically had to target larger areas. It's still often used this way, but as accuracy increased, target of opportunity fire missions became more common.
And that's why we see, the gruesome pictures of World War II and One. All cities just absolutely obliterated. Literally had to rebuild entire grid squares on maps because the artillery fire was its main objective was to absolutely destroy and obliterate those areas. Very, very effective if you want to ruin grid squares off maps. But, in terms of the collateral damage, in terms of the severe loss of life, the amount of individuals involved in rebuilding the whole thing, globally, it's not good for anyone, especially when war is, fundamentally, one of the reasons that war exists is to make money. So it's not really cost effective to do it that way. No one's really talking about that, the cost effectiveness of war. Blasting, parts of the map off with artillery strikes is no good for either side. You've got the rebuild costs, you've got the sheer amount of civilian deaths that are definitely going to happen with collateral damage. It's just, it's not good for anyone, really.
Now, for example, a lot of the artillery strikes we've been seeing are aimed at more specific and smaller targets, even individual vehicles like tanks. Counter battery fire has become much more effective as well. Radars can quickly calculate backward to where an enemy shell came from and then fire back on it before it can withdraw to safety. But it's still no magic bullet. There are so many variables that can affect accuracy, such as the weather, the changing temperature of the barrel after each shot, the age of the barrel, calibration errors, defects in production, and much more.
So what he's saying is it's only smart up until a certain point, okay? You can only have smart kit and equipment to a certain point when other elements and stuff really do take effect, okay? And I think that's an important thing to consider.
Around 7,176 per day, also with a wide margin of error. His numbers, though, are based off a period from May 19th through the 31st, and the level of intensity of combat in Ukraine has varied greatly throughout the course of the war, so it can't simply be extrapolated. But using NASA's firms to judge the intensity based off number of fires, which isn't perfect, but it can give you an approximate idea. Then you can limit those to only fires within artillery range, and then use our estimate per those days, times 7 because it's a week, which gives us about 1.8 million.
Yeah, I'm not really sure about the accuracy of that. And another thing we need to consider is, when you start out a war, everyone's eager to get, to get brownie points, to start leading the way. Maybe they've just had an absolute bombardment to start off with and then becoming more tactical with their strikes. It's okay blasting grid squares off the map and not really having a good strategy and not really being effective. Maybe it's the lack of armament and lack of artillery shells moving forward doesn't necessarily mean they're running out. It just might mean that they're actually more smart with their use, more more efficient with their use, should I say. And I think that's probably it, okay? I don't think that they're going to be running out of artillery shells too soon. What do you guys think?
Artillery shells fired during the total war. Now again, that has a massive margin of error, but the chart does seem to fit the timeline. Fewer shells were fired in the opening as they were rapidly advancing towards cities. Then, as progress stalled, we see larger use. After that, a big drop as Russia withdrew from the north and repositioned. Then, finally, recently, we see a steady increase as Russia conducts larger offensives in the east. But the real figure is likely somewhere within 50% plus or minus of that number. So, say 1 to 2.6 million.
1 to 2.6 million, I mean... We might as well have just not used that statistic. That's the problem when you're trying to gather information like this. And although these channels do their very, very best, it's really, really tough to gauge numbers, especially in war, because you have to be out on the ground to do that. Now, I know they're using satellite imaging from NASA, all the Gucci equipment and all of that good stuff. But still, those numbers are just not accurate at all. If you can be millions here, there, and everywhere, left or right, then you might as well just not count those numbers in the slightest.
These numbers sound like a lot, but it's important to put in context. During the end of the Korean War, the US and allies were averaging firing more than 2 million artillery shells a month.
Yes, but those were very different times. Very, very different times. The old military doctrine, and when you look into history and how we actually did things, to be in the military 60, 70, 100 years ago was a bloody scary thing. I mean, you literally were used as cannon fodder. There was no mistake in that. That's why people were so scared, because if you were an infantry guy, you were used for a very specific reason. The amount of artillery that got blasted on grid squares at the time in the face of soldiers was it was truly hellish, all right, hell on earth. I'm glad I served in the time that I did, although the wars that were ongoing during and before the time I served were horrific. I don't think anything quite compares in modern history to the old wars, World War One, World War Two, the Malaysian Wars. Yeah, those men truly were used as cannon fodder.
But that 1.8 million artillery rounds may be a lot or a little depending on the arsenal available. Russia doesn't release any numbers, so we really don't know how many they have. One estimate we could make comes from looking at US inventories. In 1994, it was stated that the US Army had nearly 21 million artillery shells of all types. Around that same time, treaties like the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe and the opening up of former Soviet states revealed that they had roughly 37 million tons of conventional munitions. The US at the time had about 6 million. If that ratio is consistent as to the percentage being artillery shells, it implies that the Soviet Union had nearly 130 million rounds.
So, yeah, that's an awful lot, guys. Can that be used quick time? And I do think so. In wars like Ukraine, especially the amounts that they're using, them numbers can dwindle pretty quick. You know, be rest assured those numbers right now will be dwindling. However, we've heard in the past few weeks and months that a lot of Russia's armament, kit and equipment, munitions and stuff is all old stuff. Hasn't really been looked after. It hasn't aged well. Even the vehicles that they were using, you know, on these airfields were there for 20, 30 years. The tires didn't even have air in them. They were, you know, punctured. Some of the vehicles didn't start. They weren't even washed and they weren't regularly maintained and serviced. So, you know, I can imagine the stockpiles of artillery shells is going to be no different, all right? And which makes me think it doesn't matter what the numbers are, there's a large quantity of those probably don't even work anymore.
Another figure could be calculated based on artillery ratio, if you assume that a comparable number of artillery shells were made for each piece. At the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union had roughly twice the number of artillery as the US, which could imply an arsenal at the time of 42 million artillery shells. But the Soviet Union and Russia have always held on to larger stockpiles of weaponry, ever since they were invaded by Germany in World War II, so they likely have higher reserves. So it's likely that the late Soviet Union artillery round stocks, therefore, probably were somewhere between 75 to 150 million. That's 30 years ago though. Since then, both sides have destroyed large amounts of weaponry. The current total stockpile the US has is...
Have they, though? Have both sides destroyed on purpose a lot of their stockpiles? Why would they destroy a lot of their stockpiles? I'll be honest, I can't even guess an answer to that. If someone in the chat could let me know, any military historians out there or anything, was that done on purpose? Why would you destroy your military supplies? I don't think it's a good enough reason at this moment in time for me to even guess.
Kept secret. But they use a somewhat complex formula to calculate how many are needed, or TAMR, the Total Army Munitions Requirement. It takes into account estimates based on ongoing operations, homeland security, forecasting future threats and warfare, and the number needed to sustain operations for a period of time, munitions needed for at least 6 months of training, testing, and more.
Right, so we know the United States will be doing that. We can count on the United Kingdom, France, Germany, other countries to be doing that. This is something that I don't think Russia will be doing too much of, all right? If they're not taking their vehicles out, servicing them and maintaining them and putting fuel in them and air in the tires, you know, the extreme basic stuffs en masse, are they really doing this type of stuff? Are they auditing what they've got and, you know, making sure that it's all in these right boxes there? I honestly don't think they are. I don't think they're as professional as that.
But based on force structure, the production rates of new rounds, and other sources, the US likely has somewhere between 3 and 4 million artillery shells total. The US has also sent around 250,000 155mm rounds to Ukraine. Russia also demilitarized a large amount of its conventional munitions in the 90s, however, often lacking funds to properly dispose of it. Russia also sold a lot of its surplus ammo for very low prices, or even gave it away for free to other nations, and threw the rest in storage. Also, a sizable percentage of their stored munitions were apparently completely obsolete, some of them even dating back to the early 1900s.
Right, yeah, that doesn't surprise me in the slightest. The way Russia is at this moment in time is just... Any kind of news like this does not surprise me now. It really doesn't. You know, we've heard some strange things on the news. Whether that's propaganda from the West or not, I'm not sure. But, we've got to take it for what it is.
The US has been cutting back with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and they've been procuring extremely accurate and much longer range rounds such as the XM1113. It's rocket assisted, nearly doubling its range to 40 kilometers, and has a precision guidance kit, giving it the ability to precisely hit small targets such as individual vehicles.
Right, these things, although they cost a lot more money, in my opinion, are so much more effective. Probably cost effective as well when you take into the fact that if you need to take out a specific target at a specific time, what's the point of just riddling a place with artillery shells when you can use one of these weapon systems and take out what you need and then leave everything else? The collateral damage is minimal as well, all right? You're just doing what you need to do when you need to do it. I think this is a much more cost-effective way. In terms of how war is fought, if this was fought smarter, I would like to think that the lack of that civilian life would be preserved better in the areas of war. I don't know, it's an interesting concept that. Hopefully you understand where I'm coming from. If we were smarter at war, although I don't agree with war in the slightest, I don't think it should ever happen. I wish it never happened. If we were smarter with how we fight on both sides, collateral damage should be literally next to nothing, It's an interesting topic to debate about that.
It's an incredible round, but at $8,300 each, it's almost 10 times more than the $840 M795 round. So
yeah, that's a lot of money, guys, I'm not going to lie. Whether that's cost effective or not, I might just take that back.
So it's eating up a lot more of the budget, but if it can accurately strike a target that would normally require 10 or more rounds to hit, then it's worth it.
So he's just hit onto the very same thing that I was talking about, the cost effectiveness of war. He couldn't have said it better himself.
But back to Russia.
I couldn't have said it better myself, rather. We don't get everything right, guys, and I don't edit these videos, so you get the mistakes as well.
Russia is really good at building ammunition. Things like rifle rounds and artillery shells are relatively simple and require few sophisticated electronics or materials. Everything they need can be found domestically. Therefore, things like sanctions will not directly hurt production, unlike...
So that's something I didn't know about. I was thinking this the other day, I was going to do a little bit more research on the matter. The fact that they can produce all of their munitions in-house, sanctions won't affect them directly. Indirectly, they will. It's all about how much money you've got to be able to produce these things. These things cost money, but we know how Russia works. They'll do things by force if necessary. So, even if the money runs out, they're going to get people to make the munitions for them, with or without pay. You know what I'm saying? So, I don't think that's going to bother. The sanctions are not going to bother Russia too much. Having that capability to build in-house means you don't have to rely on the rest of the world. It goes without saying, guys. That's something that you need. That's something that you want.
Missiles, aircraft, tanks, etc. Their production capabilities exceed that of the US. Manufacturers, such as Techmash and others, are believed to be able to scale up production to well over 1 million rounds a year. But one factor I didn't discuss is the several forward ammo depots that Ukraine has been destroying recently. The actual number of munitions Russia is losing in these strikes is negligible, each one consisting of a few days' use of artillery at most. However, it's important because it greatly complicates Russian logistics.
And we know about Russian logistics. Don't get me started on Russian logistics. I'm going to throw this out here. I would go as far as saying in modern times, I think Russia's logistics is among the worst we've ever seen. Not because they don't have the infrastructure, not because they don't have the kit and equipment, but they lack correct, proper leadership from the top. And I mean the very top as well. I'm talking about from, all the way from Vladimir Putin himself. The man is surrounded by yes men. If you think about it, if he didn't lead in the way he led, and is leading currently, if he took a more democratic approach to things, and he truly wasn't this fearsome, reputable person, I genuinely think that he would get more people around him telling him what he needs to hear. And if that happened, if that scenario was created where he wasn't surrounded by yes men, I genuinely think with the infrastructure, the people of Russia are hardworking, the size of Russia, the geographical location of Russia, I genuinely think that there probably could be a bloody good superpower if they were morally aligned correctly from the government standpoint, that is. And it's just a few short things, a few small things that are, literally stopping them from achieving that and making the whole world hate them in the process. It's crazy, isn't it, that one guy can literally serve the fate of an entire nation. Crazy.
Cruise and ballistic missiles, and the chipping away at Russian artillery takes away a lot of the advantages Russia has over Ukraine. And it could also give Ukraine the ability to assemble and conduct counteroffensives to take back some of the land it lost. That is, unless Russia figures out how to adapt, which, along with logistics, is another extremely, extremely important factor in war. As the saying goes, no plan survives first contact with the enemy.
You know something? I think we'll stop that video that particular video there, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Troops, before we do that video, if you want to watch the full video, is by a channel called Covert Cabal. I will put the link in the description. Fantastic channel. Make sure you go support them. Without them, we couldn't do reaction videos like this. No plan survives first contact. That's very, very true. So what does that mean for you? What does that mean for me, being a former service personnel in the British military? Well, what I was taught, and this is something that the Royal Marines have been extremely good at since 1664, the 28th of October, to be precise, since our conception. We've been adaptable, and I know everyone likes to think they're adaptable and they can adapt to certain situations. Every military would like to have that is something that they can brag about to people. But in truth, not every military group can. And it's something that the Royal Marines, you just have to look at our war accolades, our honours list, our battle honours and all of that, where we've been around the globe. We truly are adaptable. We can bloody adapt to a lot of situations. You got to think about the budget that Britain has always been, let's face it, pretty shit. We've had to adapt and overcome many situations. The Americans have had to do the very same thing. Really, really good at being adaptable. You got to be malleable to these situations. And I think Russia is not. I don't think they do like to adapt. I think as a country, you just have to look at how they run their country holistically with government. The government doesn't like to change. Why? Because they like to benefit themselves first and the people last. So when you look at the structure of a country and how it runs and operates, you'll get a good insight into how adaptable they are as a whole. Britain, we've had to adapt since the beginning of time, and I think we're really, really good at doing that, and you've got to do that in war. You have to. If you don't learn from your mistakes, then you're never going to learn at all. And I think we'll leave it on that note, guys. If you've enjoyed this video, if you've made it this far, drop a comment so I can gauge how many people are still watching the video this far. And yeah, thanks for stopping by. Thank you for all of the support. If you're a military veteran, serving personnel, currently serving, then I just want to say thank you for your service, and I appreciate your viewership. Troops, if you want to become a member, hit the link below, become a member, support the channel. But other than that, thank you very much. I really do appreciate it. Until next time, bye-bye.